The candle on the desk had burned halfway down when Duke Alexander Whitmore looked up from his papers and said the words that would change everything. "Become my wife, now." He did not ask. He did not soften his voice. He said it the way he gave every other order in his house, as if the answer had already been decided before the question left his mouth. Elena Marsh stood by the door with a tray of cold tea in her hands, because she had been sent to bring it an hour ago and had waited outside, afraid to interrupt him while he worked. She had not expected to be pulled into the room at all, let alone told this. For a moment she thought she had misheard him. The tray shook slightly in her hands, and the porcelain cups clinked against each other. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I think you misspoke." "I did not misspeak." Alexander rose from his chair. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that always looked like he had run his fingers through it too many times. His eyes were sharp, used to command, used to being obeyed without question. "I need a wife within the month. You will be that wife." Elena set the tray down on the small table near the door, because her hands would not stop trembling, and she did not trust herself not to drop it. She had worked in Thorne Manor for 3 years. She had scrubbed these floors, polished this very desk, and dusted the portraits of Whitmore ancestors that hung along the hallway outside. In all that time, the Duke had spoken to her perhaps a dozen times, and never about anything more personal than whether the fire in his study needed more wood. "I am a maid," she said. "You are a duke. This is not something that can simply be commanded." "Everything in this house can be commanded," Alexander said. "I am commanding this." There was a long silence. Outside, rain had begun to tap against the tall windows of the study, and somewhere down the corridor, a clock ticked with a steadiness that felt almost mocking against the tension in the room. Elena looked at the man in front of her, this man who owned the house she worked in, the land her family's cottage sat on, and in some ways, the very bread on her table. He held more power over her life than almost anyone alive. And yet, standing there in her plain gray dress with her hands finally still at her sides, she felt something rise in her chest that she had not expected to feel in this moment. Not fear, something closer to anger. "No," she said. The word landed in the room like a dropped glass. Alexander blinked, as though he had heard a language he did not recognize. In 29 years of life, first as the son of a duke, and then as a duke himself, no one had ever refused him something he asked for directly. Servants did not refuse him. Business partners did not refuse him. Even his own mother, in her sharpest moods, rarely told him no and meant it. "What did you say?" "I said no, Your Grace." Elena kept her chin level, though her heart was hammering so hard she thought he might hear it. "I will not marry you." For a moment, something flickered across his face that was not anger, not exactly. It looked almost like curiosity, buried under irritation. He studied her the way he might study a ledger that did not balance, searching for the error that would explain the strange result in front of him. "You understand what I am offering you," he said slowly. "You would leave this life of scrubbing floors. You would have a title, servants of your own, security for the rest of your days." "I understand what you are offering," Elena said. "I do not understand why you think it does not require my consent." Alexander's jaw tightened. He walked around the desk, closing some of the distance between them, though he did not come too near. "I do not have time for a courtship, Miss Marsh. I do not have the luxury of choosing a bride from among the young women of noble families who would agree to this in an instant, out of ambition if nothing else. I need a wife who will not complicate what needs to be a simple arrangement. I believed a woman in your position would understand the value of what is being handed to her." There it was, the truth beneath the command. He had not chosen her because he saw anything in her. He had chosen her because he believed she had no power to say no, and no reason to want to. The realization stung more than she expected it to, and it also steadied her, because now she understood exactly what kind of exchange this was meant to be. "You are mistaken about a great many things, Your Grace," she said. "But you are especially mistaken if you believe that because I have little money, I also have no dignity to protect." Alexander did not answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the window, where the rain had grown heavier, streaking down the old glass in long silver lines. Behind him, the fire in the hearth cracked and settled, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. Elena watched his shoulders, tense beneath his dark coat, and wondered what exactly was chasing him hard enough to make him demand marriage from a stranger in his own household. "You may go," he said finally, without turning around. "We will speak of this again. There is nothing further to discuss." "There is a great deal further to discuss," he said, and for the first time, his voice lost some of its command, and carried something rougher, something almost desperate beneath the surface. "You do not yet know what is at stake. When you do, you may find your answer changes." Elena did not respond to that. She picked up the tray she had set down, because leaving it there felt like leaving a piece of the conversation behind, unfinished and exposed. She walked to the door, and just as her hand touched the handle, his voice reached her again, quieter this time. "Miss Marsh." She paused, but did not turn. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "It is more than I usually receive in this house." She left without answering, because she did not know what to say to a man who commanded her hand in marriage, and then thanked her for refusing him in the same breath. Out in the corridor, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, and let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. Her heart was still racing. Her hands, when she looked down at them, had gone pale from gripping the tray too hard. Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, found her there a few minutes later, and took one look at her face before setting down the basket of linens she was carrying. "What happened in there, girl? You look as though you have seen a ghost." "Nothing happened," Elena said, which was not true, and both of them seemed to know it. Mrs. Doyle studied her a moment longer, then shook her head slightly and picked her basket back up. "Whatever it was, keep it to yourself if you can. This house has enough gossip already, what with the old Duchess's will causing such a fuss among the family." Elena's ears caught on that last sentence, though she said nothing more, and continued down the corridor toward the kitchen, her thoughts spinning faster than she could organize them. A will, a fuss among the family. The Duke's sudden, desperate need for a wife within the space of a single month, delivered to her like an order rather than a request. Pieces of something larger were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, though she did not yet have enough of them to see the full shape. That night, lying on her narrow bed in the small room she shared with another maid named Betty, Elena stared up at the cracked ceiling and turned the evening over and over in her mind. She thought of her mother, back in the small cottage at the edge of the estate, growing weaker each month with a cough that never seemed to fully leave her lungs. She thought of the money she sent home every quarter, money that was never quite enough to pay for the medicine the doctor in town recommended. She thought of her younger sister, gone now for 4 years, and the promise Elena had made to herself the day they buried her, that she would never again let a man of wealth and title convince her that his word was worth more than her own judgment. Betty stirred in the bed across the room. "You're thinking loud enough to wake the dead, Elena." "What is it?" "Nothing you need worry over," Elena said, though her voice betrayed her. "It's the Duke, isn't it?" Betty said, sitting up slightly. "Everyone in the kitchen is already whispering that he called you into his study alone. Cook near dropped a pot when she heard." Elena closed her eyes. Word traveled through a house like this faster than fire through dry grass. By morning, everyone from the stable boy to the head cook would have some version of the story, most of it wrong, some of it worse than the truth, though she doubted anyone would guess the actual truth even if they tried. "He asked me something," Elena admitted finally, "something I refused." Betty's eyes went wide in the dim light. "You refused the Duke. Elena, are you mad? A man like that could turn you out of this house with a single word. And then where would your mother be, with no money coming in at all?" "I know what is at risk," Elena said quietly. "I have thought of little else since I left his study." "Then why refuse him?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the shadows the candle threw against the wall. "Because some things cost more than they are worth, even when refusing them costs everything else." Betty did not understand, not fully, and Elena did not explain further, because the full truth belonged to a night 4 years ago that she rarely let herself remember in detail. She only knew that when the Duke had said those words to her, "Become my wife," now, something old and painful inside her had risen up immediately, some instinct sharpened by grief, and it had answered before her mind had even finished processing the shock of the demand. She did not sleep well that night. She woke twice, certain she had heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door, though when she checked, there was no one there. By the time the gray light of morning crept through the small window, she had convinced herself that whatever strange demand the Duke had made, it would pass, forgotten in the light of day, the way so many odd moods of powerful men often were. She told herself she would go about her work as usual, scrub the floors, polish the silver, avoid his study whenever possible, and let the household gossip die down on its own. She was wrong. At breakfast in the servants' hall, before the sun had even fully cleared the hills beyond the estate, Mr. Higgins, the butler, entered with a face so stiff and formal that every maid and footman in the room fell silent at once. He cleared his throat and looked directly at Elena. "Miss Marsh, His Grace requests your presence in the study." Immediately, a ripple went through the room, whispers passing from one servant to the next like sparks jumping between dry branches. Elena set down her spoon, aware of every eye in the hall turning toward her, and rose from the bench with as much composure as she could manage, though her stomach had tightened into a hard knot. She followed Mr. Higgins through the long corridors of the manor, past the portraits of dead Whitmores staring down with painted disapproval, past the tall windows that looked out over the misty grounds, until they reached the heavy oak door of the study. Mr. Higgins knocked once, then opened the door and stepped aside to let her pass, closing it behind her with a soft click that felt, to Elena, like the closing of a trap. Alexander stood by the window this time, not seated behind his desk, and when he turned to face her, she saw that the sharp command from the night before had been replaced by something else, something that looked almost like exhaustion. "I owe you an explanation," he said, before she could speak, "and perhaps an apology, though I am not entirely certain how to give one properly, since it is not a skill I have had much occasion to practice." Elena said nothing, waiting, because whatever was coming, she suspected it would finally answer the questions that had kept her awake half the night. "Sit, please," Alexander said, gesturing toward the chair near the fire. "This will take some time to explain, and I find it easier to speak the truth when I am not staring up at someone standing over me like a soldier awaiting orders." Elena hesitated, then sat, perched on the edge of the chair, as though ready to rise again at the first sign of trouble. Alexander remained standing, pacing slowly in front of the fire, and began to speak in a voice that, for the first time since she had known him, sounded less like a duke and more like a man carrying a burden he had grown tired of carrying alone. "My grandmother, the old Duchess, passed away 8 months ago," he began. "You may remember the mourning that was observed in the house at the time. What you likely do not know is the condition she attached to her will, a condition that has hung over my head every day since her death, like a blade waiting to fall." He stopped pacing and looked at Elena directly. "She left the bulk of the family fortune, along with control of several estates including this one, in trust. That trust passes fully into my hands only if I am married before the first anniversary of her death. If I remain unmarried past that date, everything passes instead to my cousin, Reginald Ashford." Elena's brow furrowed. "And if it passes to him?" "Then every tenant on this land, every servant in this house, every family that depends on the income from these estates, will find their lives entirely at the mercy of a man who has already made it clear he intends to sell off half the land to pay his gambling debts, and who has never once, in his entire life, shown concern for anyone but himself." Alexander's voice had grown harder, edged with something that sounded like old, familiar frustration. "I have watched him circle this inheritance for months, waiting for me to fail, waiting for the date to pass so he can seize everything my grandmother built and destroy it within a year." "And so you decided to marry a maid rather than a woman of your own class," Elena said slowly, "because you believed I would have no choice but to agree." Alexander did not deny it. "I believed a great many things that I am beginning to reconsider," he said. "I believed the arrangement would be simple, practical. I did not expect it to matter to me whether you agreed willingly or not, so long as the marriage satisfied the terms of the will. I was wrong to think that way, and your response last night made that clear to me rather forcefully." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculation she expected to find there, the cold practicality of a man simply trying to save his fortune. She found some of that, certainly, but she also found something else, something rawer, a kind of fear that a man like Alexander Whitmore had likely never allowed anyone to see before. "Why tell me all of this now?" she asked. "You could have simply found another woman willing to agree without question." "Because I have less than a month remaining, and every woman of standing I might approach would require weeks of courtship performances that I do not have time for, and because," he paused, choosing his next words carefully, "because, after last night, I find that I would rather have an honest refusal from you than a false agreement from anyone else. The fire popped softly in the silence that followed. Elena looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, and thought of her mother's cough, growing worse with each passing month, and the medicine that cost more than she could afford, and the debt that had been quietly growing at the small shop in town, where she bought what little she could for her family. She thought, too, of the tenants on this land, families she recognized from church on Sundays, families who would suffer greatly under a landlord like the one Alexander described. "What exactly are you proposing now?" she asked carefully, "since it seems it is no longer simply a command." Alexander's shoulders eased slightly, as though her question alone was a small mercy after the tension of the last day. "I am asking," he said, "not commanding. I am asking if there is any arrangement you would consider, on your own terms, that might allow us both to solve the problems standing in front of us." Elena did not answer right away. Outside, the rain from the night before had finally stopped, and pale morning light was beginning to break through the clouds, falling in soft patches across the study floor. She thought of everything she stood to lose by refusing outright, and everything she might lose in a different way by agreeing too quickly, and she understood, with a strange and heavy clarity, that whatever she decided in the coming days would shape the rest of her life far beyond anything she had imagined when she woke that morning, expecting nothing more than another ordinary day of scrubbing floors. "I will need time to think," she said finally, "and I will need to know a great deal more before I give you any kind of answer, even a conditional one." "That," Alexander said, with the faintest trace of something that might have been relief, "is more than fair." She left the study that morning with far more questions than answers, but for the first time since the candle had burned low the night before, she felt as though she were standing on solid ground, rather than being swept along by someone else's storm. Whatever happened next, she told herself, walking back down the long corridor past the silent portraits of the Whitmore family, she would meet it as herself, and no one else's command would decide the shape of her own life, without her consent, ever again. The knock on the cottage door came just as Elena's mother began another fit of coughing, so severe that the whole thin frame of her body shook with it. Elena rushed to her mother's side first, pressing a cup of warm water into her hands, and only when the coughing eased did she turn to answer whoever waited outside. She was not prepared to find Alexander Whitmore standing on the muddy path in front of her family's cottage, dressed plainly, without the trappings of his title, looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him. "Your Grace," she said, startled. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see for myself," he said, "the life you would be leaving behind, and the reasons behind your hesitation. I thought it only fair that I understand what I am asking you to give up, rather than assume I already know." Elena glanced back into the small, dim room where her mother sat wrapped in blankets, despite the mild spring weather outside, and felt a flush of something between embarrassment and defiance rise in her chest. She had spent years working to keep this cottage clean and warm despite everything, and she did not appreciate having it examined like an exhibit for a wealthy man's curiosity. "There is nothing here you need to see," she said. "My reasons are my own." "I did not come to judge you," Alexander said quickly, as though sensing the direction of her thoughts. "I came because after our conversation this morning, I realized I know almost nothing about the woman I asked to marry me, beyond the fact that she works hard and speaks her mind more honestly than anyone else in my household. I found that troubling, given what I am asking of you." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing whether to send him away or allow this strange, unannounced visit to continue. In the end, curiosity and something else she did not want to name won out over caution, and she stepped aside to let him into the small front room, though she kept her voice low so as not to disturb her mother further. "My mother is unwell," she said quietly. "She has been for over a year now. The doctor in town says it is her lungs, weakened from years of hard work and poor winters, and that proper medicine and warmth might slow its progress, though nothing will cure it fully." Alexander's eyes moved to the older woman resting near the small fire, her face pale and thin, her breathing audibly labored even from across the room. Something shifted in his expression, a hardness giving way to something gentler. "And the money you earn at the manor," he said slowly, "goes toward her care." "Most of it," Elena admitted. "What is left after rent on this cottage, and food for us both. It is never quite enough, but it is what I have." "You mentioned last night that some things cost more than they are worth," Alexander said. I have thought of little else since you said it. I wonder now if you meant more than simply the loss of your own freedom. Elena's jaw tightened at the memory the question stirred, but she found, to her own surprise, that she did not want to hide it from him entirely. Perhaps it was the sight of him standing awkwardly in her small cottage, so far removed from the polished confidence he carried in his own study. Or perhaps it was simply exhaustion, from carrying the weight of an old grief alone for so long. Whatever the reason, she found herself speaking words she had not shared with anyone outside her own family in years. I had a younger sister, she said. Grace. She was 17 when a young lord from a neighboring estate began courting her, though courting is a generous word for what he did. He made promises, marriage, a life of comfort, an escape from the poverty our family had always known. She believed him, because she was young, and because he had every appearance of sincerity, and because a girl like her had few reasons to doubt the word of a man with a title. Alexander said nothing, only listened, his gaze steady on her face. He abandoned her the moment she told him she was carrying his child. Elena continued, her voice steady, despite the old ache beneath the words. He denied ever knowing her, publicly, in front of half the town. Our family was disgraced. My father, who had always struggled with drink, grew worse, and left within the year. My mother's health began to fail not long after, and Grace herself never recovered from the shame and the grief of it all. She died 2 years later, still a young woman, having never once received an apology or acknowledgement from the man who ruined her life with nothing more than a few pretty words and a title that meant he never had to face any consequence for what he did. The cottage was silent, except for the low crackle of the fire, and Elena's mother's slow, careful breathing. Alexander stood very still, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of its usual command. I am sorry, he said. Truly. No apology from me will undo what happened to your sister, but I want you to know that I understand now why my demand last night struck you the way it did. I was, without meaning to be, another man of title assuming that a promise or an order from someone in my position should simply be accepted without question. I see now how deeply that assumption could wound someone who has already paid such a terrible price for another man's carelessness. Elena had not expected him to understand so quickly, or so completely, and the unexpected clarity of his response left her momentarily without words. She had braced herself for pity, or worse, for the kind of polite discomfort that people often showed when confronted with a story too painful to sit with honestly. Instead, Alexander looked as though her words had settled into him somewhere deep, reshaping something in how he saw not just her, but perhaps himself as well. That is why I could never simply agree to what you asked of me, she said finally. Not because I do not understand what is at stake for you, or for the people who depend on this estate, but because I promised myself, standing beside my sister's grave, that I would never again let a man with power over my life believe that his wishes mattered more than my own choice. Then let me ask you properly, Alexander said, not as a command, but as a question deserving of a real answer. If I were to offer you an arrangement built entirely on your own terms, one where your consent matters at every step, and where you are never asked to pretend affection you do not feel, would you consider it? Not for my sake alone, but for what it might mean for your mother's care, and for your own future beyond this cottage. Elena's mother stirred slightly at the sound of raised voices, though she did not wake fully, and Elena found herself looking at the frail woman who had raised her, who had lost a husband and a daughter to circumstances neither of them could control, and who now faced a future of illness with dwindling resources. She thought of the tenants on the estate as well, families who would suffer terribly if Reginald Ashford gained control of the land, families whose fates were now somehow tangled up with her own decision, in ways she had never expected to carry. What terms would you agree to, she asked slowly, if I were to consider this? Alexander did not hesitate. Whatever you require, a written agreement, if that would ease your mind, stating clearly that this marriage exists to satisfy the conditions of my grandmother's will, and nothing more, unless both parties choose otherwise at some future point. Full support for your mother's medical care, regardless of what you ultimately decide, and my word, for whatever it may be worth to you given everything you have shared with me today, that I will never treat your consent as something owed to me simply because of my title. Elena looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the manipulation her sister had once been blind to, any hint of hollow promises dressed up in noble language. She found instead a kind of desperate sincerity that surprised her. The look of a man who had spent his whole life being obeyed, and was only now, for perhaps the first time, learning what it meant to truly ask. "I will consider it," she said at last. "But I will need to see the terms in writing before I give you any answer, and I will need to speak with my mother, though I do not yet know how to explain any of this to her without frightening her." "Take whatever time you require," Alexander said. "I have caused enough harm rushing this matter already. I will not make that mistake again." He left shortly after, walking back up the muddy path toward the road where his horse waited, and Elena stood in the doorway watching him go, her mind a tangle of thoughts she could not fully untangle. Behind her, she heard her mother's voice, weak but curious. "Elena? Who was that man?" Elena turned back into the small room and knelt beside her mother's chair, taking her thin hand gently between her own. "Someone who has made me a very strange offer, Mother," she said. "One I am still deciding whether to accept." Her mother studied her daughter's face with the sharp perception that illness had not managed to dull, even after all these years. "You look like a woman standing at a crossroads, Elena. What kind of offer could put that look on your face?" Elena hesitated, then began, slowly and carefully, to explain everything that had happened since the candle had burned low in the Duke's study the night before. Her mother listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to concern to something more thoughtful as the story unfolded. "And you refused him outright," her mother said when Elena finished, "even knowing what a marriage like that could mean for us." "I could not simply agree to being commanded, Mother. Not after everything that happened to Grace." Her mother's eyes softened at the mention of her lost daughter, and she squeezed Elena's hand with what little strength remained in her frail fingers. "Your sister's story is not this man's story, Elena, though I understand why the echo of it frightened you so badly. From what you describe, he came to you this time not with a command, but with an honest question, and a willingness to put his promises in writing, rather than simply asking you to trust his word alone. That is no small difference. You think I should consider it then?" "I think," her mother said slowly, each word costing her visible effort, "that you have spent 4 years guarding your heart so carefully against another man's careless power, that you may be at risk of refusing even genuine change, out of old fear, rather than present judgment. I am not telling you what to decide, my dear. I am only asking you to consider whether your answer is coming from who this man has shown himself to be today, or from the shadow of a man who hurt your sister long before you ever met the Duke." Elena sat with her mother's words for a long while after that, long after her mother had drifted into an exhausted sleep, long after the fire had burned down to embers and the evening chill had begun creeping into the small cottage. She thought of the written agreement Alexander had promised, of his willingness to visit her humble home and listen to a story most men of his station would never have cared to hear, and of the strange, careful respect with which he had responded to it all. She did not sleep that night either, but for entirely different reasons than the night before. Where fear and anger had kept her awake previously, it was now something closer to careful, cautious hope, a feeling so unfamiliar after years of guarding against it, that she almost did not recognize it for what it was. By the time morning came, she had not yet decided what her final answer would be, but she had decided, at least, that she was willing to see the written terms Alexander had promised her, and to judge the offer honestly on its own merits, rather than through the lens of old wounds alone. The following afternoon, a carriage arrived at the small cottage, and out of it stepped not Alexander himself, but a formally dressed solicitor carrying a leather folder tied neatly with ribbon. He introduced himself as Mr. Farrow, explained that His Grace had asked him to deliver the documents personally, and to answer any questions Elena might have, and then waited patiently while she read through the pages by the light of the window. The terms were exactly as Alexander had promised, laid out in careful legal language that left little room for misunderstanding. The marriage would exist to satisfy the conditions of the late Duchess's will. Elena's mother would receive full medical care for as long as she required it, regardless of the marriage's ultimate outcome. Elena herself would retain the right to end the arrangement after an agreed period if she found it unbearable, with financial provisions made for her independence should that occur. And nowhere in the document was there any demand for affection or performance of feelings she did not hold. "His Grace asked me to convey one further message," Mr. Farrow said, as Elena finished reading. "He said to tell you that whatever you decide, He intends to honor the medical provisions for your mother regardless, because no person's health should be used as leverage in a negotiation, and he regrets that his initial approach may have made it seem as though it were. Elena looked up from the papers, surprised by this addition, which appeared nowhere in the formal document itself. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of gesture that could not be faked easily, a promise that cost him something regardless of her answer, offered without any guarantee of return. "Please tell His Grace," she said slowly, folding the papers carefully, "that I will give him my answer within 3 days." Mr. Farrow bowed slightly and departed, leaving Elena alone once more with her mother, the fire, and the weight of a decision that would shape not only her own life, but the lives of everyone who depended on the choices made within the walls of Thorn Manor in the weeks to come. Reginald Ashford burst through the doors of the small study he had claimed as his own within his townhouse in the city, throwing a crumpled letter onto the desk with such force that the inkpot rattled against its tray. His companion, a sharp-featured woman named Charlotte Vale, looked up from the chair where she had been quietly reviewing a stack of financial papers, one eyebrow raised at his obvious agitation. "I take it the news from the estate is not to your liking," she said dryly.
"He has found a bride," Reginald snapped, pacing before the fire with quick, agitated steps.
"Some maid from his own household, if the letter from my contact is to be believed. A maid, Charlotte. My cousin, the great and proud Duke of Thorn, intends to marry a woman who scrubs his floors, all so he can satisfy that ridiculous condition in my grandmother's will and keep the entire fortune out of my hands." Charlotte set down her papers slowly, her expression sharpening with interest rather than alarm. "A maid," she repeated. "That is, in its way, a gift, Reginald, if you have the wit to use it properly. A woman of noble birth marrying for the will would present you with almost nothing to work with. But a maid, with no family connections, no wealth, no standing among the nobility to protect her, that is a target with far more vulnerable points than you might find in any titled bride." Reginald stopped his pacing and looked at her, some of his agitation cooling into calculation. "Go on." "Every servant has a past," Charlotte said, rising from her chair and moving toward the window, where the city street below bustled with carriages and pedestrians, unaware of the quiet scheming taking place above them. "And every past can be examined for weaknesses, if one knows where to look and whom to pay for the information. Find out everything about this maid, her family, her history, anything that might make her an unsuitable bride in the eyes of society, or better still, anything that might convince her to walk away from this arrangement entirely before the wedding can take place." Reginald's expression brightened, for the first time since he had stormed into the room. "And if we find nothing scandalous in her past, then we manufacture doubt where doubt is easiest to plant," Charlotte said simply. "Society does not require proof to destroy a reputation, Reginald. It requires only suggestion, delivered to the right ears at the right moment. A whispered rumor in a drawing room does more damage than any court of law ever could, and it requires no evidence at all to spread." Reginald crossed to his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, already composing in his mind the letter he intended to send to a private investigator he had used before, for matters requiring discretion. "I want everything known about this Elena Marsh within the week," he said. "Her family, her history, anyone she has ever known who might be persuaded to speak against her for the right price. And if we find a genuine weakness," Charlotte said, watching him write, "what do you intend to do with it?" Reginald smiled, an expression that held none of the warmth it might have carried on another man's face. "Whatever proves most effective. If she can be frightened into breaking the engagement herself, all the better, since it requires no direct action from us at all, and leaves Alexander scrambling to find another bride with no time remaining before the deadline passes. If she cannot be frightened, then perhaps she can be shown, quite clearly, what happens to people who stand between me and what belongs to me by right of blood and birth." Charlotte said nothing further on the matter, though something in her expression suggested she found his confidence somewhat premature. She had worked alongside Reginald long enough to know that his schemes often carried more ambition than careful planning, and she made a private note to ensure that whatever information they gathered on this maid would be verified thoroughly before any action was taken based upon it. A misstep here, exposed publicly, could damage Reginald's own reputation far more severely than anything they might uncover about Elena Marsh. 3 days later, back at Thorn Manor, Elena sat once more in the study across from Alexander, the written agreement resting on the small table between them, now signed with her own careful signature beneath his. The formal decision had been made, the terms accepted, and yet a strange, uncertain silence had settled over the room in the aftermath, as though neither of them was entirely certain how to proceed now that the arrangement had moved from theoretical possibility to binding reality. "I want to thank you," Alexander said finally, breaking the silence, "for trusting me with this decision, given everything you shared with me about your family's history. I do not take that trust lightly." "It is not trust exactly," Elena said honestly. "It is a calculated choice, made with my eyes open to what this arrangement is and is not. I would ask that we both remember that, in the weeks ahead, so that neither of us mistakes practicality for something it was never meant to be." Alexander nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he was turning her words over more carefully than she perhaps intended. "Understood," he said. "Practicality, and nothing more, unless circumstances should ever change in a way that requires renegotiation of these terms." "They will not change," Elena said, with more certainty than she entirely felt. "Perhaps not," Alexander agreed, though his tone left the matter somewhat open in a way that made Elena briefly uncertain whether he was simply humoring her or genuinely disagreeing with her assessment. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and Mr. Higgins entered with the careful, measured steps of a man delivering news he suspected would not be entirely welcome. "Your Grace, a letter has arrived from London, from Lord Reginald Ashford." Alexander's expression darkened immediately, and he took the letter from the butler's outstretched hand with visible reluctance, breaking the seal and reading quickly while Elena watched, her own curiosity mixing with a growing sense of unease at the mention of the cousin who had already been described to her as someone determined to seize the family fortune by any means available. "He has heard of the engagement already," Alexander said, once he finished reading, his voice tight with restrained anger. "He offers his congratulations, in the most insincere language imaginable, and requests the pleasure of meeting his future cousin-in-law at a gathering he intends to host in the city within the fortnight." "You believe this is more than simple courtesy," Elena said, watching his face carefully. "I believe Reginald does nothing without purpose, and that purpose is rarely kind," Alexander said. "He will use this gathering to examine you closely, to search for anything he might use against the legitimacy of this marriage, or against you personally. I would understand entirely if you wished to refuse the invitation, though I fear refusing it entirely might raise suspicions of its own." Elena considered this carefully. She had never attended a gathering of the nobility in her life, had certainly never been examined as a potential bride, under the scrutiny of people who would see nothing in her but an opportunity for gossip or scandal. The prospect frightened her, though she found, beneath the fear, a stubborn thread of the same defiance that had made her refuse Alexander's initial command. "I will not hide from your cousin," she said finally. "If he intends to search for weaknesses, let him search. I have survived worse scrutiny than a room full of wealthy strangers with nothing better to occupy their time than judging a stranger's manners." Something that might have been admiration flickered across Alexander's face. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Marsh." "I imagine I will continue to do so," Elena said, "given how little you seem to have expected of me before all of this began." Over the following days, preparation for the gathering consumed much of the household's attention. Mrs. Doyle, informed at last of the true nature of Elena's changed circumstances, took it upon herself to oversee Elena's transformation from housemaid to future duchess with a fierce, protective energy that surprised everyone, including Elena herself. "You will not walk into that room looking like anything less than a woman fully deserving of her place beside the Duke," Mrs. Doyle declared, standing over a collection of fabric samples spread across a table in one of the manor's unused sitting rooms. "Whatever games that Ashford family intends to play, they will not find an easy target in you, not if I have any say in the matter." Elena, standing awkwardly while a dressmaker measured her for a new gown, found herself unexpectedly moved by the older woman's fierce loyalty. "I did not expect you to take my side so completely, Mrs. Doyle, given how strange all of this must seem." "Strange, certainly," Mrs. Doyle agreed. "But I have worked in this house long enough to see how His Grace has been these past weeks, worn thin with worry over that will and his cousin's schemes. I have also seen enough of you these past 3 years to know you are no fool, and no pushover either. If you have agreed to this arrangement with your eyes open, then I will do everything in my power to see it succeed, whatever shape it ultimately takes. The dress, when finished, was a deep blue that Elena had never imagined wearing in her life. Simple in its elegance, but unmistakably fine in its craftsmanship. Looking at herself in the mirror on the evening before their departure for London, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her, and felt a strange mixture of pride and apprehension at the transformation. Alexander, when he saw her descend the manor's grand staircase the following morning dressed for travel, went momentarily still, his expression unreadable in a way that made Elena's pulse quicken slightly despite herself. "You look every bit the part," he said finally, offering his arm to help her into the waiting carriage. "I am beginning to understand," Elena said, taking his arm carefully, "that looking the part and feeling it are two very different matters entirely." "That," Alexander said, as the carriage door closed behind them and the horses began their journey toward London, "is something I have understood about myself, for rather longer than I care to admit." The journey to London took the better part of 2 days, with an overnight stop at a respectable inn along the way, during which Elena and Alexander found themselves, for the first time since the arrangement began, simply talking, without the weight of formal negotiation or written terms hanging over every word. He asked about her childhood before her family's troubles began, and she found herself telling him about summers spent by the small river near her family's original home, about her father before drink had claimed the better parts of him, about small, ordinary joys that had nothing to do with dukes or wills or desperate arrangements. In turn, Alexander spoke, hesitantly at first, and then with growing openness, about his own childhood, about a father who had died when he was young, and a mother who had retreated into grief so completely that Alexander had learned early to manage the estate's affairs largely alone, guided only by tutors, and the occasional stern letter from his grandmother. He spoke of the loneliness of a childhood, spent being trained for duty, rather than allowed simply to be a child. And Elena found herself listening with a sympathy she had not expected to feel for a man she had, only days before, viewed primarily as a source of unwelcome demands. "I never intended for any of this to become personal," Alexander admitted, as they sat by the small fire in the inn's private sitting room the evening before continuing their journey. "The arrangement was meant to be exactly what the papers describe: practical, temporary in feeling, if not in legal fact, a solution to a problem and nothing more." "And now?" Elena asked, watching the firelight play across his face. Alexander was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Now I find myself considerably less certain of what this is becoming than I was a week ago, and considerably more curious to find out." Elena did not know how to respond to that honestly, caught between the careful boundaries she had insisted upon, and a warmth she had not expected to feel toward this man who had, only days before, been little more than a distant and demanding employer. She said nothing, and Alexander, seeming to sense her uncertainty, did not press the matter further, though the silence between them that followed felt different than the silences that had come before, charged with something neither of them was yet ready to name. They arrived in London the following afternoon, and Elena's first sight of Reginald Ashford's grand townhouse, ablaze with lights for the evening's gathering, filled her with a nervousness she worked hard to conceal beneath a composed exterior. As their carriage drew to a stop before the entrance, Alexander turned to her with an expression of quiet reassurance. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "remember that you owe explanation to no one in that room. You are there because I have chosen you, and my judgment does not require their approval to be sound." "That is easy to say," Elena replied, smoothing the fabric of her gown, with hands that were not quite steady, and considerably harder to believe when one is about to walk into a room full of people, prepared to judge every word and gesture. "Then believe it, because I am telling you it is true," Alexander said, "and because I intend to remain beside you throughout the evening, to ensure no one forgets it either." With that small, unexpected promise settling some of her nerves, Elena took his offered arm and stepped down from the carriage, into the bright lights and watchful eyes of Reginald Ashford's grand entrance hall, ready to face whatever scrutiny the evening had prepared for her. The ballroom of Reginald Ashford's townhouse glittered with candlelight, reflected in tall mirrors along every wall, and the moment Elena stepped through the doorway on Alexander's arm, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her at once. Conversations did not stop entirely, but they shifted in tone, dropping to the kind of hushed murmur that told her, more clearly than any spoken word could, that everyone in the room already knew exactly who she was and where she had come from. Reginald himself crossed the room to greet them with a smile that did not reach his eyes, extending a hand toward Elena with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure those nearby could hear every word. "What an unexpected pleasure. My cousin has told me so little about you, though I confess I have heard a great deal from other sources." "Reginald," Alexander said, his voice carrying a warning edge beneath its polite surface. "I trust you intend to be a gracious host this evening." "Always," Reginald said smoothly, though his eyes lingered on Elena with an assessing coldness that made her skin prickle. "Come, Miss Marsh, let me introduce you properly to some of our guests. I am certain they are all eager to learn more about the woman who has captured my cousin's attention so thoroughly." Elena felt Alexander's arm tense beneath her hand, but she squeezed it gently, a silent signal that she was prepared to face whatever came next. She had spent the carriage ride reminding herself of exactly this moment, and she was determined not to shrink from it now that it had arrived. "I would be glad to meet your guests, Lord Ashford," she said, keeping her voice steady and clear, "though I hope they will forgive me if I am somewhat unfamiliar with the customs of gatherings such as this one. I have spent most of my recent years occupied with rather more practical matters." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small circle of guests who had gathered to listen, though whether it was laughter at her expense or genuine amusement at her candor, Elena could not immediately tell. Reginald's smile flickered slightly, as though he had expected either nervous silence or an attempt to hide her background rather than acknowledge it directly. "How refreshingly honest," said an older woman standing nearby, adjusting her spectacles to study Elena more closely. "I am Lady Pemberton. Tell me, my dear, what sort of practical matters occupied you before this rather remarkable change in your circumstances?" Elena met the woman's gaze steadily. "I worked as a housemaid at Thorn Manor for 3 years, Lady Pemberton, tending to the daily needs of the household. Before that, I helped care for my family, after circumstances left us with rather less than we once had." "And now you find yourself engaged to a duke," Lady Pemberton said, though not unkindly. "Quite the change in fortune." "Quite the change in circumstances, certainly," Elena agreed. "Though I would not describe it entirely as fortune, given the reasons behind it." This last comment drew a curious look from several nearby guests, and Elena realized, with some alarm, that she had perhaps said more than was wise regarding the true nature of the arrangement. Alexander, sensing the same danger, stepped smoothly into the conversation. "My grandmother's will required a marriage within a certain time frame," he said, his tone light but firm, closing off further inquiry. "Elena's honesty about the circumstances of our meeting is one of the qualities I find most admirable in her, though I suspect it may take some time for society's more elaborate customs of discretion to rub off, if they ever fully do." The comment drew genuine laughter this time, easing some of the tension that had been building, and Elena felt a flush of gratitude toward Alexander for his quick recovery of the moment. Reginald, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes, seemed less pleased by how smoothly the potential embarrassment had been deflected. "Come, Miss Marsh," Reginald said, his voice taking on a sharper edge beneath its continued politeness. "Surely a woman raised amid such practical circumstances must have interesting stories to share. Tell us about your family. Your father, perhaps? I understand he departed the family home rather suddenly some years ago." The room seemed to grow quieter, and Elena felt Alexander go rigid beside her, clearly recognizing the deliberate cruelty behind the seemingly innocent question. She understood immediately what Reginald was attempting, digging into the painful details of her family's history in front of an audience, hoping either to embarrass her into silence or provoke some reaction that would make her appear unsuitable for the position she now occupied. Elena took a slow breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "My father struggled greatly after difficult circumstances befell our family, Lord Ashford," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the tightness in her chest. "He was not a perfect man, and I will not pretend otherwise, to spare anyone's curiosity. But I have never found shame in speaking honestly about hardship, only in pretending it never happened at all. I wonder, does your own family history contain no difficulties worth examining so closely, or do you simply prefer to reserve such scrutiny for those who cannot answer it, with the protection of an old name?" The silence that followed was sharp and immediate, several guests exchanging startled glances at the boldness of her response. Reginald's expression darkened for a moment before he forced a thin smile back onto his face. "Spirited," he said, his tone now considerably cooler. "I suppose that is one quality a duke might find useful in a wife, though I confess, I would have expected rather more deference, given the disparity in your positions." "Perhaps," Elena said evenly. "Deference is easier to demand than to earn, Lord Ashford, and I have found that respect, when it is genuine, requires rather less demanding altogether." Alexander, watching this exchange with something between alarm and undisguised admiration, decided the moment called for intervention before Reginald's obvious irritation escalated into something more dangerous. "If you will excuse us," he said smoothly, "I believe Miss Marsh has not yet had the opportunity to view the gardens, and the evening air is particularly fine tonight." He guided Elena away from the small crowd with practiced ease, and once they had gained some distance from Reginald and his gathered guests, Elena finally allowed herself to release the breath she had been holding throughout the entire exchange. "That was considerably more than I bargained for," she admitted quietly, once they had stepped out onto the stone terrace overlooking the darkened garden below. "You handled it better than I could have hoped," Alexander said, his voice warm with genuine admiration. "I have watched grown men of considerable standing crumble under far less pointed scrutiny than what my cousin just attempted against you." "He will not stop with tonight," Elena said, watching the play of moonlight across the garden hedges below. "A man like that does not simply accept a single failed attempt and move on." "No," Alexander agreed, his expression growing serious once more. "He will not. I suspect tonight was merely his opening assessment, a chance to see what weaknesses might be worth pursuing further. We should expect further attempts, likely more subtle and more dangerous than what occurred here this evening." Elena wrapped her arms around herself slightly, though the evening air was mild rather than cold. "What might he attempt next, do you think?" "I do not know precisely," Alexander admitted. "Though knowing Reginald, I would guess he intends to dig further into your family's history, searching for anything that might be twisted into scandal, or perhaps attempting to approach you directly when I am not present, to see if he can unsettle you through more private means." "Then I will simply need to remain prepared," Elena said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. They stood together in silence for a while longer, the sounds of the gathering continuing faintly behind them through the tall windows of the ballroom, until a soft voice interrupted their quiet moment. "Your Grace." Miss Marsh. Charlotte Vale stood at the edge of the terrace, her expression carefully neutral, though something calculating remained visible beneath her polite smile. "I hope I am not intruding." "Miss Vale," Alexander said, his tone cooling immediately, clearly familiar with the woman and her association with his cousin. "What brings you out to the gardens?" "Merely seeking some fresh air, Your Grace." "Much like yourselves," Charlotte said smoothly. "Though I confess I hope to have a brief word with Miss Marsh, if you would permit it, woman to woman, without the burden of an audience." Alexander glanced at Elena, silently asking whether she wished to entertain this request, and Elena, curious despite the obvious risk, gave a small nod. "I do not mind a brief conversation, Miss Vale, provided it remains civil." "Of course," Charlotte said, waiting until Alexander had stepped a discreet distance away before continuing, her voice dropping lower, and losing some of its earlier polish. "I will speak plainly, Miss Marsh, since I suspect you would prefer honesty to false pleasantries. Reginald intends to make your life considerably difficult in the weeks ahead. He is not a man who accepts losing gracefully, and he views this marriage as theft of what he believes rightfully belongs to him." "Why tell me this?" Elena asked carefully, "when you are clearly working alongside him in this pursuit?" Charlotte's expression flickered with something that might have been genuine consideration, perhaps because I have spent enough years observing men like Reginald to understand that loyalty offered to such men is rarely returned with equal measure. Perhaps I simply find it more interesting to watch how this particular situation unfolds than to guarantee its outcome entirely in his favor. Whatever my reasons, I would advise you to be careful, Miss Marsh. Reginald has resources and connections you cannot easily anticipate, and he will use every one of them if given sufficient reason." Before Elena could respond further, Charlotte gave a small, unreadable smile and returned to the ballroom, leaving Elena standing alone on the terrace with far more questions than answers about the true nature of the woman's warning. When Alexander returned to her side moments later, she relayed the strange exchange, and his expression grew even more troubled. "Charlotte Vale is no ally of mine," he said slowly, "but she has also never struck me as a woman who acts without calculated purpose. If she chose to warn you, even obliquely, it suggests she either doubts Reginald's chances of success, or she is preparing some advantage of her own that requires your continued presence in this arrangement, rather than your hasty departure from it." "Either way," Elena said, "it seems we have gained at least one uncertain and possibly unreliable source of information within Reginald's own circle." "An uncertain advantage is still an advantage," Alexander said, "though we would be wise not to place too much trust in it either." They returned to the gathering shortly after, navigating the remainder of the evening with careful vigilance, aware now that every conversation, every seemingly innocent question, might carry hidden intentions designed to unsettle or expose them. By the time their carriage finally pulled away from Reginald's townhouse late that night, Elena felt exhausted in a way that had little to do with physical tiredness, and everything to do with the constant, careful performance the evening had demanded. "You did remarkably well tonight," Alexander said quietly, as the carriage rattled through the darkened London streets toward the townhouse where they would stay before returning to the estate. "Better, I think, than I would have managed in your position." "I am not certain remarkable is the word I would choose," Elena said, leaning her head back against the carriage seat with weary relief. "Terrified seems considerably more accurate." "Terrified and remarkable are not mutually exclusive qualities," Alexander said, with a small smile that Elena, in the dim light of the carriage, found unexpectedly comforting. "In fact, I would argue the two often go hand in hand in anyone facing genuine difficulty with any measure of courage." Elena studied him for a moment in the shadowy carriage, considering how different this quiet, thoughtful man seemed from the cold, commanding figure who had ordered her to become his wife only days before. "You have changed considerably, Your Grace, since that first evening in your study." "I have been given considerable reason to reconsider a great many things since that evening," Alexander admitted, "not least among them my assumptions about what a person's circumstances say about their character, and what genuine partnership might actually require, beyond simple commands and expected obedience." Elena did not respond immediately, uncertain what to make of the warmth that had settled between them despite everything, uncertain whether it was wise to trust the shifting dynamic of an arrangement she had entered with such careful, guarded boundaries. But as the carriage continued through the quiet London night, she found herself, for the first time since this strange journey began, looking forward to whatever conversation might come next, rather than dreading it. The private investigator Reginald had hired arrived at his townhouse 3 days after the gathering, carrying a leather satchel filled with papers, gathered from weeks of quiet inquiry into every corner of Elena Marsh's past. Reginald dismissed his servants from the room and gestured for the man, a thin, sharp-eyed individual named Mr. Colby, to lay everything out on the desk before him. "Tell me you have found something useful," Reginald said, his patience already thin after the disappointing outcome of his gathering. "A great deal, my lord," Mr. Colby said, spreading several papers across the desk with careful precision, "though I confess much of it paints a rather sympathetic picture, rather than a scandalous one. The Marsh family fell into hardship some years ago, after the father developed a serious drinking problem, exacerbated by grief, following the loss of a younger daughter." "The younger daughter," Reginald said, leaning forward with sudden interest. "Tell me more." "A girl named Grace Marsh," Mr. Colby continued, consulting his notes. "She died some 4 years ago, officially of a fever, though local gossip at the time suggested rather different circumstances. It seems she had been involved with a young nobleman before her death, a Lord Whitfield, who denied any connection to her publicly, and swiftly left the county to avoid the scandal." Reginald's expression sharpened with interest. "And this connects to Elena Marsh how?" "Precisely?" "The sisters were reportedly quite close," Mr. Colby said. "Elena Marsh has apparently harbored significant resentment toward men of noble birth ever since her sister's death, according to several servants I interviewed at length regarding the family's history. It is not difficult to imagine how such a background might be presented unfavorably, should the story reach the right ears in London society." Reginald studied the papers before him with growing satisfaction. "This is useful, Mr. Colby, though perhaps not in the way you might expect. I do not need to prove Elena Marsh did anything scandalous herself. I need only ensure that society believes a woman with such bitter history toward the nobility cannot possibly harbor genuine affection or loyalty toward my cousin, making the entire marriage appear suspect, a calculated arrangement, rather than a legitimate union, deserving of the inheritance it protects. There is more, Mr. Colby added, producing another folder from his satchel. The mother's medical condition has grown considerably worse in recent months. The local doctor's records suggest she may have only a limited time remaining, regardless of what care she receives. This could be leveraged as well, should you wish to apply pressure through less direct means. Reginald's smile grew colder as he considered this new information. Leave everything with me, Mr. Colby. You have done excellent work, and you will be compensated accordingly. I believe I now have exactly what I require to ensure my cousin's little arrangement collapses well before it can be finalized. After the investigator departed, Reginald sat for a long while considering his options, eventually calling for Charlotte to join him in reviewing the gathered information. She read through the papers with careful attention, her expression giving away little of her true thoughts on the matter. You intend to use the mother's illness, she said finally, setting the papers down. That seems a rather dangerous path, Reginald. Threatening a sick woman's care crosses a line that public opinion, should it ever come to light, would not forgive easily. I do not intend to threaten anything directly, Reginald said smoothly. I merely intend to ensure Miss Marsh understands precisely how fragile her mother's continued care truly is, should this marriage fall under sufficient scrutiny to be dissolved before completion. A subtle reminder, delivered privately, requires no public action at all. And if she refuses to be intimidated, Charlotte said, as she demonstrated rather clearly at your own gathering that she is not easily frightened, then we escalate, Reginald said simply. Every person has a breaking point, Charlotte, regardless of how brave they appear in a crowded ballroom. I intend to find hers, one way or another, before the month is out. Back at Thorn Manor, unaware of the precise nature of the scheme forming against her, Elena had settled into an uneasy rhythm of preparation for the wedding that now loomed only weeks away. The household staff, initially shocked by her transformation from housemaid to future duchess, had gradually come to accept the new arrangement, many of them, like Mrs. Doyle, offering quiet support as Elena navigated the unfamiliar demands of her changing role. Her relationship with Alexander, too, had continued to shift in ways neither of them had anticipated when the arrangement began. Their conversations, once stilted and formal, had grown easier, filled with genuine curiosity about each other's thoughts and histories, rather than careful negotiation of boundaries. Elena found herself, more often than she cared to admit, looking forward to the evenings when Alexander would seek her out after his day's business concluded, simply to talk, without any pretense of formal purpose behind the conversation. It was during one such evening, as they walked together through the manor's gardens beneath a sky just beginning to darken toward twilight, that a messenger arrived bearing an urgent letter from Elena's home village. Elena's stomach dropped the moment she saw the seal, recognizing it as the hand of the local doctor who attended her mother. She broke the seal with trembling fingers and read quickly, her face growing pale as she absorbed the contents. My mother has taken a turn for the worse, she said, her voice tight with sudden fear. The doctor says I should come as soon as possible. Alexander did not hesitate. I will have the carriage prepared immediately. We can leave within the hour. The journey to the small cottage felt longer than it ever had before, Elena's mind consumed with worry as the carriage rattled through the darkening countryside. When they finally arrived, she rushed inside to find her mother pale and weak in her bed, breathing with obvious difficulty, despite the doctor's attempts to ease her discomfort. Elena, her mother whispered, reaching for her daughter's hand with what strength remained to her. You came. Of course I came, Mother, Elena said, kneeling beside the bed and pressing her mother's hand between her own. I will always come, whatever else changes in my life. The doctor, a kind but weary man named Dr. Bennett, drew Alexander aside, while Elena remained with her mother, speaking in low, careful tones. Her condition has worsened considerably these past weeks, Your Grace. I have done what I can, but her lungs are simply too weakened to recover fully. I would not wish to give false hope, though with proper rest, warmth, and continued care, she may yet have some time remaining. Whatever care she requires, Alexander said immediately, spare no expense in providing it. I will send for a specialist from London if necessary, and ensure this cottage is properly supplied with everything needed for her comfort. Dr. Bennett studied the Duke with evident surprise at the immediacy and sincerity of his response. That is generous of you, Your Grace, particularly given the circumstances of your engagement to Miss Marsh, becoming rather widely discussed in recent weeks. Her mother's health is not a matter for negotiation or calculation, Doctor, Alexander said firmly. Whatever else this arrangement may or may not be, I gave my word that her care would be provided regardless, and I intend to honor that promise fully. Over the following days, Alexander arranged for a specialist physician to travel from London to examine Elena's mother personally, along with additional supplies of medicine and comfort that the small cottage had never before contained. Elena, watching this unfold with growing gratitude, found herself increasingly unable to view the arrangement between them as merely practical, despite her earlier insistence on maintaining strict boundaries around the true nature of their relationship. "You did not need to do all of this," she said quietly one evening, as they sat together outside the cottage, while her mother rested inside, under the care of a nurse. Alexander had also arranged to hire. The written agreement only required basic medical provisions, not physicians brought specially from London. "I am aware of what the agreement required," Alexander said. "I chose to exceed it because your mother's well-being matters to me beyond the terms of any written document, and because I have come to care, rather more than I anticipated when this arrangement began, about easing whatever burdens I am able to ease in your life." Elena looked at him in the fading evening light, searching his face for any sign of calculation or performance, and finding instead only quiet sincerity. "I do not know what to say to that," she admitted. "You need not say anything," Alexander said. "I did not share it, expecting a particular response. I simply wanted you to know the truth of my intentions, whatever you choose to do with that knowledge." It was during this period of intensified worry over her mother's health that Reginald made his move, sending a carefully worded letter directly to Elena, rather than through any official channel, delivered discreetly by a messenger who claimed no knowledge of its true sender until Elena opened it to find Reginald's unmistakable signature at the bottom. The letter was polite in its language but unmistakable in its threat, suggesting that certain information regarding her sister's tragic history and her family's difficult circumstances might soon find its way into wider circulation among London society, unless Elena chose to reconsider the wisdom of proceeding with a marriage that clearly caused her such visible distress. It further suggested, with careful ambiguity, that certain arrangements regarding medical care and financial support might prove considerably less stable should the engagement collapse under mounting public scrutiny, implying without stating directly that Reginald possessed the influence to disrupt even the private agreements Alexander had made regarding her mother's continued care. Elena read the letter twice, her hands growing cold despite the mild evening air, before folding it carefully and deciding, after a long moment of internal debate, that she would not hide this development from Alexander, regardless of how difficult the conversation might prove. She found him in the small sitting room of the cottage, going over correspondence related to the estate's ongoing business, and without preamble, she handed him the letter and watched his expression darken as he read through Reginald's carefully veiled threats. "This is unacceptable," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger once he finished reading. "He has no right to threaten your mother's care, nor to expose your family's private grief for his own political gain."
"He believes it will frighten me into ending this arrangement,"
Elena said. "And I will admit, reading his words, that fear is exactly what I felt, if only for a moment." "And now?" Alexander asked, watching her carefully. Elena straightened, some of the old defiance returning to her posture, as she considered the letter now resting on the table between them. "Now I find myself considerably more angry than frightened, and rather more determined than ever, not to let a man like Reginald Ashford dictate the shape of my life, through threats hidden behind polite language." Alexander's expression shifted from anger to something that looked, in the dim candlelight of the small room, remarkably like pride. "Then we face this together," he said. "Whatever Reginald intends to reveal, whatever pressure he intends to apply, we will meet it directly, rather than allowing fear to dictate our choices." "Together," Elena repeated, testing the word and finding, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not resist the weight of partnership it implied nearly as strongly as she once might have. They spent the remainder of that evening discussing how best to respond to Reginald's threats, weighing the risks of confronting him directly against the dangers of allowing his scheme to continue unchallenged. By the time Elena finally retired for the night, exhausted from the day's worry over her mother and the new complication of Reginald's letter, She understood clearly that whatever came next in this arrangement, she would not be facing it alone. A realization that brought her more comfort than she had expected to find in the midst of such mounting difficulty. Reginald received no reply to his letter for nearly a week, a silence that unsettled him far more than any angry response might have. He had expected tears, panic, perhaps even a desperate visit from Elena herself, begging him to keep her family's history private. Instead, nothing came, and the uncertainty began to gnaw at his confidence in ways he was unwilling to admit even to Charlotte. "Perhaps your letter did not land with the impact you intended," Charlotte observed one afternoon, watching him pace the length of his study with mounting agitation. "A silence can mean many things, Reginald. It may mean she is frightened into inaction. It may equally mean she has decided to ignore the threat entirely, having consulted with your cousin about how best to respond." Alexander would never allow such information to remain quiet if it threatened his precious arrangement, Reginald said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Would he not?" Charlotte asked. "From what I observed at your gathering, your Grace seemed rather more invested in defending Miss Marsh than in protecting his own reputation from any scandal her past might invite. I would not assume his response will follow the pattern you expect from a man motivated purely by self-interest." Reginald's frustration grew with each passing day of silence, until finally, nearly 2 weeks after sending his letter, he received an unexpected visitor at his townhouse. Alexander himself, arriving without prior announcement, his expression carrying none of the careful diplomacy that usually governed interactions between the two cousins. "Reginald," Alexander said, once shown into the study where his cousin sat working through correspondence. "We need to speak, and I would prefer to do so without an audience." Reginald gestured for his servant to withdraw, though something in his expression suggested he was already bracing for an unpleasant confrontation. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit, cousin?" Alexander produced Reginald's letter from inside his coat and placed it deliberately on the desk between them. "This," he said, his voice cold with barely contained fury. "I know precisely what you intended by sending this to Elena, and I want you to understand clearly that whatever scheme you believe you are pursuing has already failed." Reginald's expression flickered with surprise, before settling back into careful neutrality. "I merely offered Miss Marsh some friendly counsel regarding the wisdom of proceeding with an arrangement that seems to cause her considerable personal distress." "Do not insult my intelligence with such thin pretense," Alexander said. "You threatened to expose her family's private grief for public scandal, and you implied, without stating outright, that you possessed the influence to interfere with her mother's medical care, should the engagement continue. I know exactly what this letter represents, Reginald, and I will not tolerate it." "And what precisely do you intend to do about it?" Reginald asked, some of his earlier bravado returning as he leaned back in his chair. "Our grandmother's will remains clear on its conditions, and nothing in this letter changes the legitimacy of any marriage you choose to pursue. If you wish to accuse me of some wrongdoing, I would remind you that a private letter offering counsel is hardly evidence of any crime worth pursuing in any court. I am not here to pursue legal action," Alexander said. "I am here to tell you, directly and without ambiguity, that if you make any further attempt to threaten Elena, her family, or anyone connected to this household, I will ensure that every detail of your gambling debts, your outstanding obligations to half the merchants in London, and the considerably less flattering aspects of your own history, become known to every member of society whose opinion you have spent years carefully cultivating. I have remained silent about these matters out of respect for family, Reginald, but that respect has clear limits." Reginald's face paled slightly at this threat, clearly not having anticipated that his cousin, usually so careful to maintain family dignity even amid their disputes, would be willing to expose such damaging information publicly. "You would not dare risk the family's reputation so carelessly." "I would risk considerably more than reputation to protect the woman I intend to marry from your schemes," Alexander said, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even himself as the words left his mouth. "Test me on this matter again, Reginald, and you will discover precisely how far I am willing to go." He left the townhouse without waiting for further response, leaving Reginald sitting in stunned silence, his earlier confidence considerably shaken by the unexpected ferocity of his cousin's defense. Charlotte, who had remained nearby and overheard much of the exchange, entered the study once Alexander had departed, studying Reginald's shaken expression with quiet interest. That did not go as you anticipated, she observed. He threatened to expose everything, Reginald said, still visibly rattled. The debts, the obligations, all of it, publicly, before all of society. And you believe he would follow through on such a threat? Reginald was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. I believe, he said finally, that I have never before seen my cousin defend anything with such genuine ferocity, not even his own inheritance, when I first began circling it after our grandmother's death. Whatever this maid has become to him, it is clearly no longer a matter of simple practical arrangement. Charlotte's expression grew thoughtful at this observation. Then perhaps, she said slowly, it is time to reconsider whether continuing this pursuit serves your interests, as well as you originally believed. Reginald, a man defending genuine affection is a far more dangerous adversary than one protecting mere practical convenience. Reginald did not answer immediately, though the seed of doubt Charlotte had planted seemed to take root as he sat considering his next move, uncertain for the first time since beginning this scheme whether his pursuit of the inheritance was worth the escalating risk his cousin's unexpected devotion now represented. Back at Thorn Manor, unaware of the exact details of Alexander's confrontation with his cousin, but sensing from his mood upon returning that something significant had occurred, Elena found him in his study later that evening, staring into the fire, with an expression she had not seen on him before, a mixture of exhaustion and quiet resolve. You went to see him, she said, taking a seat near the fire, without waiting for invitation, a familiarity that would have seemed impossible only weeks before. I did, Alexander confirmed. I made certain he understood clearly that any further attempts to threaten you or your family would carry consequences he is not prepared to weather. And did he understand? I believe he did, Alexander said, though whether understanding translates into genuine restraint remains to be seen with a man like Reginald. Elena studied him for a long moment, considering the risk he had taken on her behalf, exposing family secrets and threatening public confrontation for a woman he had, only weeks before, viewed as little more than a practical solution to an inheritance problem. Why did you do this? She asked finally, when the safer path would have been to simply ignore his letter and hope the matter resolved itself quietly. Alexander turned from the fire to look at her directly, his expression unusually open and unguarded. Because I find that I can no longer view this arrangement as merely practical, Elena, however carefully we both agreed to define its boundaries at the beginning, I care what happens to you, genuinely and completely, in a way that has surprised me as much as it may surprise you to hear it spoken aloud. Elena's breath caught slightly at the directness of this admission, feeling the careful boundaries she had constructed around her own heart begin to waver under the weight of his sincerity. Alexander, she said softly, using his given name for the first time since their arrangement began. I do not know what to do with feelings I promised myself I would never allow again, particularly not toward a man of your position. I am not asking you to resolve those feelings tonight, Alexander said gently. I am only asking that you know the truth of my own heart, whatever you eventually decide to do with that knowledge. Whatever happens between us, beyond the requirements of my grandmother's will, know that my protection of you tonight came from genuine care, not mere obligation. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, the fire crackling softly between them, and Elena found herself, despite every careful boundary she had built over years of guarding her heart against the promises of powerful men, beginning to believe that this arrangement might yet become something far more meaningful than either of them had originally intended, when it began with a cold command in a candle-lit study weeks before. The following morning brought word that Elena's mother had stabilized somewhat under the specialist's continued care, a small mercy that lifted some of the weight from Elena's shoulders as preparations for the approaching wedding continued in earnest. Yet even as this immediate worry eased slightly, a new uncertainty took its place, one born, not from external threat, but from the quiet, undeniable shift happening within her own heart, toward a man she had never expected to trust, let alone to genuinely care for in return. The board overseeing the late Duchess's estate gathered in a formal chamber in London, 1 week before the deadline specified in her will, called together by Reginald himself, who had requested an emergency review of the conditions surrounding his cousin's approaching marriage. Alexander received the summons with grim understanding of what his cousin intended, and arrived at the chamber with Elena beside him, both of them prepared for whatever final challenge Reginald had constructed in his last desperate attempt to seize the inheritance. The chamber was filled with solicitors, board members, and several older relatives of the Whitmore family, who held some stake in the proceedings, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical, as Elena took her seat beside Alexander at the front of the room. Reginald rose to address the assembled group with the confident air of a man who believed he held the winning argument. "Distinguished members of the board," he began, "I have called this meeting because I believe the marriage my cousin intends to complete before the deadline does not satisfy the spirit of our grandmother's will, whatever its technical legality may be. The late Duchess intended for the family fortune to pass to a legitimate union built on genuine partnership and mutual standing, not a hastily arranged marriage of convenience to a household servant, entered into solely to preserve an inheritance that would otherwise pass, quite rightfully, to the next legitimate heir." Murmurs moved through the assembled board members, and Elena felt her pulse quicken despite her determination not to show any outward sign of distress. Alexander rose calmly beside her, his expression composed, despite the obvious challenge his cousin had laid before them. "My cousin raises an interesting point about the spirit of our grandmother's intentions," Alexander said, addressing the board directly. "Though I would remind everyone present that the will's actual language specifies only marriage within a certain time frame, with no additional requirement regarding the social standing of the bride. If our grandmother had intended such a restriction, she would certainly have written it into the document herself. A technical loophole does not satisfy genuine intent," Reginald pressed. "Everyone in this room knows our grandmother valued the dignity and standing of this family above all else. Would she truly have wished for the Whitmore name to be joined with a woman whose own family history includes considerable scandal and disgrace?" This last comment, clearly designed to reference Elena's sister's tragic history, drew sharp looks from several board members, and Elena felt the old familiar sting of shame threatening to rise within her before she forced it down with determined effort. Before Alexander could respond, she rose from her seat herself, drawing surprised glances from around the chamber at her boldness in speaking without invitation. "If I may address this directly," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Alexander glanced at her with visible concern, but did not attempt to stop her, and she continued before anyone could object to her participation. "Lord Ashford refers, I believe, to the tragic circumstances surrounding my late sister, who was betrayed and abandoned by a nobleman who made false promises he had no intention of keeping, and who faced no consequence whatsoever for the devastation this caused my family. I do not consider my sister's suffering a scandal belonging to our family. I consider it evidence of exactly the kind of careless cruelty that men of privilege too often escape without accountability, precisely the kind of cruelty His Grace has never once shown toward me or my family throughout this entire arrangement." The chamber fell silent, several board members exchanging uncomfortable glances as the weight of her words settled over the room. Elena continued, feeling a surge of the same defiance that had first led her to refuse Alexander's initial command weeks before. "I did not enter this marriage out of ambition, nor was I coerced into it against my will, as Lord Ashford seems eager to suggest. I entered it as a woman making a considered choice, with terms I negotiated myself, protections I insisted upon for my own family, and a growing respect for a man who has, throughout this process, treated my consent as something to be earned rather than assumed. If the spirit of your late Duchess's will valued genuine partnership, I would ask this board to consider what partnership looks like when built on honesty, mutual respect, and earned trust, rather than simply matching titles and family names as though marriage were nothing more than a business transaction between estates." A long silence followed her words, broken finally by one of the older board members, a stern-faced woman who had known the late Duchess personally for many years. "Miss Marsh speaks with considerable conviction," she said slowly. "I recall the late Duchess herself once remarking that she valued strength of character above all else in choosing those who would eventually inherit her legacy, having little patience for those who valued status without substance behind it." Reginald's expression tightened at this unexpected turn, clearly recognizing that Elena's unrehearsed defense had shifted the room's sympathy considerably away from his careful arguments about propriety and standing. He attempted to press his case further. "Sentiment aside, the fact remains that my cousin's marriage was arranged under duress, driven purely by the deadline in question, rather than genuine affection developed over appropriate time and courtship. I would dispute the characterization of duress, Alexander said, finding his voice again after listening to Elena's impassioned defense with evident pride. Miss Marsh refused my initial proposal outright, as several members of my household staff can attest, and only agreed to proceed after negotiating terms entirely of her own choosing, terms that protected her interests and her family's well-being above any obligation to satisfy the will's conditions. If anything, cousin, her refusal and subsequent careful negotiation demonstrate rather more genuine consideration than most marriages arranged purely for social advancement typically receive. The board members conferred quietly among themselves for several long minutes, while Reginald stood increasingly agitated at the front of the chamber, watching his careful scheme unravel before his eyes. Finally, the presiding solicitor rose to address the room. Having heard both arguments presented today, he said formally, this board finds no legal basis to challenge the legitimacy of the proposed marriage, nor any evidence that the arrangement violates either the letter or the reasonable spirit of the late Duchess's will. The marriage may proceed as planned, and upon its completion, His Grace shall inherit the full estate and fortune as specified in the original document. Reginald's face went pale with barely controlled fury at this ruling, though he said nothing further, clearly recognizing the futility of continued protest before a board that had already reached its decision. As the chamber began to empty, he approached Alexander and Elena one final time, his voice low and bitter. "This is not finished," he said quietly, though the words carried little of their earlier confidence. "I will find another way to reclaim what should rightfully be mine." "Reginald," Alexander said, his voice carrying quiet but unmistakable finality, "it is finished. Whatever grievances you carry against our family's fortune, know that I will not hesitate to defend Elena, our marriage, or our future together, against any further attempts you make to disrupt it. I would strongly advise you to direct your energy toward rebuilding your own affairs rather than continuing to pursue mine." Reginald left the chamber without further response, his shoulders stiff with barely contained anger, while Elena and Alexander remained behind, the tension of the confrontation slowly draining from their bodies as the reality of their victory began to settle in. "You did not need to defend me so publicly," Elena said quietly, once they were finally alone in the emptying chamber. "I know how much reputation matters to men of your position, and speaking so openly about my sister's history, about my own doubts and negotiations, carries its own risks to how society will view you going forward. I would rather face whatever risk comes from honesty," Alexander said, "than continue pretending our marriage is anything other than exactly what it has become, a genuine partnership between two people who have chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of each other's history, to build something real together." Elena looked at him, feeling something settle within her chest that she had spent years refusing to acknowledge, a warmth and trust she had once believed impossible to feel toward any man of wealth and title. "Something real," she repeated softly. "Is that truly what this has become, Alexander?" "I believe it has," Alexander said, taking her hand gently in his own, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the preceding weeks. "Though I recognize the final decision of what this marriage becomes still rests with you, exactly as it did the moment you first refused my command in that study, weeks ago." Elena squeezed his hand gently, feeling the weight of everything they had faced together since that first tense evening, and found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the fear which had once governed her every decision regarding men of power had given way to something far stronger and more hopeful than she had ever expected to feel again. The morning of the wedding arrived beneath a clear sky, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Thorne Manor and filling the halls with a brightness that felt, to Elena, like a quiet blessing on the day ahead. She stood before the tall mirror in what had once been simply a guest room, and was now prepared as her own, wearing a gown of pale ivory that Mrs. Doyle had insisted upon commissioning weeks earlier, when the outcome of Reginald's scheming still remained uncertain, and the entire household had held its collective breath awaiting resolution. "You look every bit the Duchess you are about to become," Mrs. Doyle said, adjusting a final fold of the gown with careful, practiced hands, her eyes suspiciously bright with unshed tears. "I confess, when His Grace first announced this arrangement, I worried for you both, wondering whether such an unusual beginning could ever grow into something genuine. I am glad to have been wrong." "You were not entirely wrong," Elena said gently. turning to face the older woman who had become, over these past weeks, something closer to family than simple household staff. The beginning was exactly as strange and uncertain as you feared. It simply did not remain that way. Her mother, seated nearby in a chair specially arranged for the occasion, her health improved enough under the specialist's continued care to attend the ceremony despite lingering weakness, reached out to take Elena's hand as she passed. "Your sister would be glad to see this day," she said softly, "not because you are marrying a duke, but because you have found a man who respects you fully, who never once asked you to become less than yourself in order to earn his affection." Elena knelt beside her mother's chair, blinking back her own tears at the mention of Grace, whose memory had shaped so much of the caution and strength Elena had carried into this arrangement from its very first tense moment. "I wish she could be here to see it," Elena said quietly. "She is here," her mother said, pressing Elena's hand gently. "In every choice you have made to protect your own dignity throughout this entire journey, and in every bit of courage you showed standing before that board, defending your family's honor, rather than hiding from it in shame." The ceremony itself took place in the manor's small chapel, attended by household staff, a handful of Alexander's genuine friends among the nobility, and Elena's mother, seated in a place of honor near the front despite her continued frailty. Reginald had not been invited, his absence from the proceedings a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had occurred between the cousins in the weeks leading up to this day. As Elena walked down the short aisle toward where Alexander waited, dressed formally but watching her approach with an expression of open, unguarded warmth that erased any lingering doubt about the sincerity of what had grown between them, she found herself thinking not of the frightened refusal she had given him weeks ago in his study, but of every small moment since that had built, slowly and carefully, into the genuine partnership now being formalized before their small gathering of witnesses. The vows they exchanged were simple, traditional in their language, but spoken with a sincerity that Elena felt in every word, both her own and Alexander's, as he promised to honor and protect her, not out of obligation to a will's requirements, but out of genuine devotion, earned through weeks of shared difficulty and growing trust. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small chapel erupted in warm applause from the gathered witnesses, and Elena felt, for the first time in 4 years, the old fear that had governed so much of her life finally begin to loosen its grip entirely. Following the ceremony, a modest celebration was held in the manor's great hall, filled with food, music, and the genuine warmth of a household that had watched this unlikely romance develop with growing affection over the preceding weeks. Betty, Elena's former roommate among the household staff, approached her during a quiet moment in the celebration, her expression a mixture of joy and lingering disbelief. "I still can hardly believe it," Betty said, embracing Elena warmly. "The maid who refused a duke's command now stands here as his duchess, married for love rather than obligation. If someone had told me this would happen, the night you came back to our room looking as though you had seen a ghost, I would never have believed them." "Neither would I," Elena admitted, laughing softly at the memory of that first frightened, uncertain night. "Sometimes, the most important things in life arrive disguised as the very things we are most determined to refuse." Later that evening, as the celebration began to wind down and guests slowly departed, Elena found a quiet moment alone, with Alexander on the same terrace where they had first stood together after the tense confrontation at Reginald's gathering weeks before. The garden below was bathed in soft moonlight, and the air carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers that had not been present during their earlier, more anxious visit to this same spot. "We have come a considerable distance," Alexander said, standing beside her at the terrace railing. "From that first evening, when I demanded, rather than asked, that you become my wife." "We have," Elena agreed, leaning slightly into his shoulder, a gesture of comfortable intimacy that would have seemed impossible only weeks before, though I find myself grateful, strange as it sounds, for that clumsy, arrogant command, since it eventually led us to this moment, however poorly it began. "I am grateful as well," Alexander said, "though I remain somewhat embarrassed by how poorly I handled that first attempt. I have learned a great deal since then about the difference between commanding compliance and earning genuine partnership." "You learned it well," Elena said, turning to face him fully. "Better, I think, than most men in your position ever bother to learn it at all." "I had considerable motivation," Alexander said, his voice soft with genuine affection. A woman brave enough to refuse a duke to his face, and wise enough to demand terms worthy of genuine respect rather than simple obedience, tends to leave a lasting impression on a man who values honesty above easy compliance. Elena smiled, feeling the warmth of the evening settle comfortably around them both. "What happens now?" she asked, "now that the will's conditions are satisfied, the inheritance secured, and Reginald's scheming thoroughly defeated?" "Now," Alexander said, taking her hands gently in his own, "we simply continue building whatever this marriage becomes. One honest day at a time, with no more commands between us. Only choices we make together, as genuine equals." "I believe I can agree to those terms," Elena said softly, and as Alexander leaned down to kiss her gently beneath the soft moonlight of the garden, she felt, at last, that the promise she had made beside her sister's grave 4 years earlier remained fully honored, not because she had avoided love entirely, but because she had finally found a love built on respect, honesty, and genuine partnership rather than careless power or hollow promise. In the weeks that followed, life at Thorn Manor settled into a new and steady rhythm. Elena's mother, freed from the worry of medical expenses and surrounded by proper care, continued to improve, her health stabilizing enough to allow visits to the manor, where she watched her daughter flourish in a role she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. Reginald, having lost both the inheritance and much of his standing among the nobility after word of his scheming, quietly spread through careful channels Alexander ensured reached the right ears, retreated from London society for a time, his ambitions considerably humbled by the failure of his careful plans. Elena herself embraced her new role as Duchess with the same quiet determination that had characterized her years as a maid, using her position to ensure the tenants and servants of the estate were treated with the fairness and respect she herself had once been denied by men of lesser character than her husband. Together, she and Alexander built a partnership that neither of them could have imagined on that first tense evening, when a desperate command had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, grown into a genuine and lasting love. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Elena would tell the story with a warm smile, describing the night a proud duke had commanded her to become his wife, and how her firm, unwavering refusal had ultimately taught them both what genuine partnership truly required. It was not, she would explain, a story about a maid rescued by a duke, nor about a duke saved from ruin by a convenient marriage. It was a story about two people who had each carried old wounds and careful defenses into an impossible situation, and who had chosen, day after day, to build something honest and lasting from what had begun as nothing more than a desperate, arrogant command in a candlelit study on an ordinary spring evening that had changed both their lives forever. The estate flourished under their joint stewardship in the years that followed, its tenants prospering, its household staff treated with a fairness that had become something of a quiet legend among the great houses of the county. Reginald eventually rebuilt some measure of his own fortune through more honest means, having learned, at considerable personal cost, the danger of underestimating those he considered beneath his notice. Charlotte Vale, whose own loyalties had always remained carefully ambiguous, eventually distanced herself from Reginald's schemes entirely, choosing instead to pursue her own independent path with the sharp intelligence she had once employed in service of his failed ambitions. As for Elena and Alexander, their marriage grew stronger with each passing year, built on the foundation they had established during those difficult early weeks, when honesty had mattered more than easy compliance, and genuine respect had proven far more valuable than any command, however forcefully delivered. What had begun as a desperate arrangement born of legal necessity had transformed, through patience, courage, and mutual respect, into exactly the kind of partnership that Alexander's grandmother, watching perhaps from wherever wise and observant spirits watch over the families they leave behind, might have hoped for all along, when she wrote the condition into her will that had, however unexpectedly, brought these two remarkable people together. The final measure of their story lived on, not in the grand halls of Thorn Manor, nor in the wealth and title that had once seemed the entire point of their unusual beginning, but in the quiet, ordinary moments of genuine partnership that followed, moments where a duke and his former maid, now equals in every way that truly mattered, continued to choose each other, freely and completely, long after any legal requirement had ceased to demand it of them at all.